But I do recall some years ago I was discussing the incredible range of Catholic art, or Christian art, I suppose, from the sublime to the crass, with my great friend Arthur, an ex-seminarian, ex-NCO, ex-senior copper, whose table I regarded as the best bistro north of Provence. I commented that in the next chapel to the one containing the Van Eyck brothers' majestic altarpiece, The Adoration of the Mystic Lamb, in Ghent Cathedral, there stands a large plastic statue of the Blessed Virgin, erected by a Mevrouw van Donk in memory of her husband, who I think was called Wim. I seem to recall, and it had a neon halo that flashed on it, but that may be an accretion of my creative imagination. We'll go and see them, said Arthur. When, said I. Tomorrow, said Arthur. So next day there we were, standing in front of these two remarkable objects. Arthur knew that they were both born of the same bedrock. He was in no way contemptuous of Mrs. Van Donk's contribution. He knew there is more to art than aesthetics, but it is born of passion, commitment, and faith. Despite the disparities of, dare I say, good taste and the passage of the centuries, the works have things in common. Both are the gifts of private donors, presumably for the glory of God, but in the case of the Mystic Lamb, possibly a little self-aggrandizement. Even more vitally, they may be described as popular works. The Van Donk Madonna is a giant version of the plastic objects containing holy water that can be bought at Lisieux, Lourdes, and many other places of pilgrimage. The purpose of the Mystic Lamb goes well beyond its artistic function. It is a demonstration for all of the path to salvation, medieval Christendom abounded with popular art in the widest sense. Of course, getting on to Shakespeare now, you see. Of course, the Elizabethan drama owes its ultimate origin to the exposition of the Blessed Sacrament for the veneration of the populace that took place on the feast of Corpus Christi. It is this that gives it its moral perspective. Shakespeare is never morally neutral, although his work has a subtlety beyond the goody and baddie scenario. It is interesting that Tolstoy considered that Uncle Tom's Cabin was a superior work to King Lear, purely on moral grounds. Within the circumscribed perspective on morality that this judgment incorporated, he may well have been right. Although I think it was Malcolm Muggeridge who pointed out that King Lear's situation too closely paralleled Tolstoy's own for that writer's comfort. The Elizabethan drama was undoubtedly a popular art form. Since Felix Mendelssohn and others attempted to recreate an Elizabethan playhouse in Berlin in the 1840s, there have been many other attempts to recreate an authentic Elizabethan stage. Most notably, recently, I suppose, at Shakespeare's Globe Theatre on the South Bank. Such attempts can be, at best, succeed only partially. We may reproduce the apron stage, the lack of scenery, and the like, but the atmosphere of the Elizabethan theatre is bound to be elusive. One of the great features of the Elizabethan stage, of course, was the comedian. We know quite a bit about the comedians that Shakespeare would have known. Richard Tarleton, a huge megastar in his time. They were all megastars. Will Kemp, you probably know about him, Kemp's Jig to Norwich. And Robert Armine, the melancholy singing clown. These people could extemporize doggerel verse about people in the audience, just as if I did it to you today. I think to get that experience, we're closer to Frankie Howard, the wonderful Ken Dodd, and Tommy Cooper. My wife said to me, there's a man outside and he's stealing the garden gate. What are you going to do about it? Nothing. He might take offence. Yeah. There you're in the presence of the Elizabethan clown. There's something, we don't have that kind of spontaneity. Something of the vulgarity, in the fullest sense of the word, of the Elizabethan drama is caught by a petition opposing the conversion of part of the old Blackfriars Monastery into a theatre by James Burbage, the original great impresario, father of the famous Richard Burbage, who created Hamlet and many other great parts. It was presented to the Privy Council by the somewhat upmarket local residents. It shows that NIMBYism is nothing new. The said Burgess meaneth very shortly to convert and turn the same into a common playhouse which will grow to be a very great annoyance and trouble, not only to all the noblemen and gentlemen thereabout inhabiting, but also a general inconvenience to all the inhabitants of the same precinct, both by reason of the great resort and gathering together of all manner of vagrant and lewd persons, that under cover of resorting to the plays will come thither and work all manner of mischief, and also to the great pestering and filling up of the same precinct. So it goes on, you know. One has to say that attending a performance at an Elizabethan playhouse may well have been more akin in today's terms to turning up at Millwall Football Club at 3 p.m. Than it has anything like the modern attending the rather upmarket audience that goes to the National Theatre or the RSC. Certainly it demonstrates that the Elizabethan theatre was popular in the fullest sense of the word. I had a feeling that that much-quoted man of the 60s, Marshall McLuhan, said something on the lines of, all great art begins as popular art and is only recognised as such by the cultural establishment in the next generation. But I searched very hard and I can't find that precise quote. Maybe I said it and not Marshall McLuhan. But it's something I'd like to sort of reflect on a little. Certainly there is an element of truth in it. What was the feeling of the Flemish peasant standing in front of the Mystic Lamb, or the Elizabethan artisan attending a performance of Hamlet? Did they realise that they were in the presence of great art? Similarly, did the Venetian, attending the premiere of Rigoletto at La Fenice on March the 11th, 1850, realise that he was in the presence of great art? Certainly he was in the presence of popular art. Verdi famously did not reveal the score of La Donna e Mobile to the orchestra until a few hours before curtain up, and forbade them to even think of the melody outside the theatre. Within weeks it was being played on every fairground organ in Europe. I recall that my music master at school had a deep loathing of popular music and tried hard, with thankfully limited success, to influence the minds of his young charges to that view. In fact, the process I prescribed to McLuhan has come to be even within cultural perceptions in our own time. I doubt whether my music master would have cared much for Rodgers and Hammerstein, but 2 generations after their heyday, they have become a feature in the promenade concerts. It's surely only a matter of time before they're followed by the Beatles, if this hasn't happened already. I was pleased to note that last year my friend Claire Teal became the first jazz singer to appear on that distinguished stage. We have another theatre on the South Bank solely dedicated to the recognition of the fact that the popular films of yesteryear can be defined as great art. I must apologise for hijacking what is meant to be a seminar on the visual arts into a discussion on popular theatre and music, but ask whether we can go beyond McLuhan's supposed generalisation. Sticking with the Shakespearean analogy, we can say that although his 2 narrative poems, Venus and Adonis and The Rape of Lucrece, were huge bestsellers, the bestsellers of the age in fact, his sonnets were circulated amongst his private friends. This was the pattern for most poetry of the age. This applies to the poems of John Donne and Andrew Marvell amongst others. It was only by a serendipitous process that their poems were published at all. We can see there is a role there for private art. This is the path followed by most visual arts in the post-Reformation period. After all, you could only look at one painting in one place at any given time. Similarly with what we call classical music in a broad generalisation, both art forms are esoteric, not for the general view, and strongly dependent on wealthy private patronage. So does art lose touch with its roots at its peril? Certainly Coleridge and Wordsworth thought so. The principal object then proposed in these poems, wrote Wordsworth in his preface to the lyrical ballads, was to choose incidents and situations from common life and to relate or describe them throughout as far as was possible in a selection of language rarely used by men. This attempt to restore poetry to the language of the common people constituted a moral imperative to rescue deep feelings from the obscurantism into which poetry had fallen. Humble and rustic life was generally chosen, Wordsworth continues, because in that condition the essential passions of the heart find a better soil in which they can attain their maturity, are less under restraint, and speak a plainer and more emphatic language, because in that condition of our life our elementary feelings coexist in a state of greater simplicity, and consequently may be more accurately contemplated and more forcibly communicated because the manner of rural life germinates from these elementary feelings. The language, too, of these men has been adopted because such men hourly communicate with the best objects from which the best part of language is originally derived, and because from their rank in society and the sameness and narrow circle of their intercourse, being less under the influence of social vanity, they convey their feelings and notions in simple and unelaborated expressions. Despite his somewhat sentimental view of the honest sons of toil, Wordsworth has a point. Art divorced from its roots is pointless. Perhaps it is inevitable that every so often a movement will appear that attempts to bring art back to where it's considered it should be. Augustus Pugine's Contrast, William Morris's Arts and Crafts movement, and Arnold Wesker's Centre 42 are all examples of that. So we revert to the image that many who describe themselves as artists like to have of themselves, that of the outsider. The outsider can come in at least two forms. One is the person whose art is so obscure as to be virtually unintelligible to others. Such people often build a cult around themselves of quite distinguished people who confuse unintelligible with intellectual. I won't name names, but I won't name names. I'm sure you can all think of your own examples of this. The other type of outsider I'm thinking of is the social prophet, who uses his art to render what is frequently a message that society doesn't really want to hear. Again, I won't name names. Well, I'll name one, Ricky DeMarco down there. He fits the bill there. Of course, we still have icons that resound with the public. The work of Anthony Gormley, Maggie Hamlin, and all the wonderful objects that adorn the empty plinth in Trafalgar Square. I used to have an office that overlooked it, and it was absolutely wonderful to see all these things, one after the other, coming along. There's that have you seen that wonderful blue chicken? Isn't that fantastic? In this context, I would mention work of Patrick Rentions in Coventry Cathedral and elsewhere, a general transposition of art and faith. Well, let me conclude with some words in praise of the pantheon of popular culture. The great American, this is what I'm saying, the great American songbook surpasses in the beauty and inventiveness of its lyrics virtually anything written by any member of the modern poetry society. Ira Gershwin, Irving Berlin, Richard Rodgers and Cole Porter, whose ability to conjure impossible rhymes matches that of W.S. Gilbert. What about do the voodoo that you do so well? The Brits made their contribution too. What about Eric Mankiewicz? These foolish things remind you of you. That wonderful line, those winds of March that made my heart a dancer. Wow. And while I'm on the subject of Eric Mankiewicz, I used to live in Catford. It was part of the London Borough of Lewisham. There's a story that Eric Mankiewicz, he wrote Goodnight Vienna, the musical Goodnight Vienna. And he was travelling up the A21 from Hastings or somewhere, and through the mists he saw a neon sign outside the Lewisham Empire, the legendary theatre in southeast London, the Lewisham Empire, and it said, Goodnight Vienna. So he stopped, and he went into the foyer of the Lewisham Empire, and there was the commissionaire there, and he introduced himself, and he said, how's it going? And the commissionaire said, well, Mr. Mankiewicz, it's a pleasure to meet you, but I have to tell you that Goodnight Vienna's going down in Lewisham, rather like Goodnight Lewisham will go down in Vienna. The English folk tradition virtually died out in the 20th century, but fortunately survived in the mountains of Tennessee and Kentucky. It was their culture too. Further south, the development of the blues and gospel traditions create a vibrant folk culture. These work their way into popular music, frequently with stunning results. A generation is revitalized. What about John Lennon's Eleanor Rigby, wearing a face that she keeps in a jar by the door? Isn't that wonderful? Wearing a face that she keeps in a jar by the door. Or the beautiful lyrics of Bob Dylan. Though I know that evening's empire has returned into sand, vanished from my hand, left me blindly here to stand, but still not sleeping. My weariness amazes me. I'm branded on my feet. I have no one to meet, and the ancient empty streets too dead for dreaming. Well, you can see what I'm doing, can't you? Maybe you can't. I'm doing exactly what Marshall McLuhan said. these aren't what I'm talking about now are not the icons of this generation. They're all things from my youth and my past. So they're all arriving on the cultural scene a couple of generations later. McLuhan's, I don't say this applies to every form of art, but certainly in terms of popular music and other forms, this is exactly what is happening. You know, people like John Lennon, Bob Dylan and everything are now regarded as wonderful cultural icons. It's well known, getting back to Marshall McLuhan, that he considers advertising to be the major art form of the 20th century. Maybe he was right, but it's difficult to find any moral prerogative in it, frequently just the opposite. Perhaps in an age of mass culture, it's design that's the major art form. Andy Warhol and other pop artists certainly thought so, with the portrayal of such American icons as Campbell's soup cans, mushroom clouds, electric chairs, and Coca-Cola bottles. Warhol realizes that mass culture is the great leveler. Here's what he said about Coca-Cola. What's great about this country is that America started the tradition where the richest consumers buy essentially the same things as the poorest. You can be watching TV and see Coca-Cola, and you know that the president drinks Coca-Cola. Liz Taylor drinks Coca-Cola. And just think, you can drink Coca-Cola. A Coke is a Coke, and no amount of money can get you a better Coke than the one the bum on the corner is drinking. All the Cokes are the same, and all Cokes are good. Liz Taylor knows it, the president knows it, the bum knows it, and you know it. So in this, if you like, totally similar things of mass culture, one thinks also the disco sound. You know, it's created by computers. It's not played by any musicians. No drummer would be able to sustain that. It's an entirely artificial form of music. So perhaps it is here that the modern artist can find his or her niche in leading the reaction against a mass culture. But finally, in this context, back to McLuhan. In my search for the precise quote that I couldn't find, I discovered that he did say, "The great artist necessarily has his roots very deep in his own time, roots which embrace the most vulgar and commonplace fantasies and aspirations." He argues that artists tend to draw upon the most banal and vulgar materials of the collective consciousness, a technique described, he suggests, in W.B. Yeats's poem, The Circus Animal's Desertion. Those masterful images, because complete, grew in pure mind, but out of what began? A mound of refuse or the sweeping of a street, old kettles, old bottles, and a broken can, old iron, old bones, old rags, that raving slut who keeps the till. Now that my ladder's gone, I must lie down where all the ladders start. So now you know the answer. Lie down where all the ladders start. Good luck.
Bravo!